Welcome back to Face the Nation from CBS News Election Headquarters in New York for a look at the political landscape in these final 2 days. We'd like to welcome Amy Walter, Ed O'Keefe, and Anthony Salvanto. Anthony, let's start with you. Okay, so we've talked about this 225 for Democrats. So what else inside those numbers? Let's talk first about, say, young voters, right? So this is an important part of the Democratic coalition. What are your numbers showing about their participation, and also your survey numbers, but also what we've learned from the early vote?
Well, what we've learned from the early vote is that it has gotten younger compared to past midterms. The question will be, is it young enough? And that, so far, seems like it is not yet young enough. So there will be some factor in turnout coming into Election Day. Look, big picture. In the polling, the Democrats are highly dependent on people who say that they have not voted in midterms before. And that's going to be about 20% of their vote if those polls are borne out on Election Day. If those folks don't show up, we've rerun the models, and the Republicans hold the House. The Republicans, hold the House. Dems only get to 215, a little gain, but not close enough.
Amy, there's been a lot of showing up going on. It's not just on Election Day, not just with early vote, but there's been checks written by people. There have been special elections. So how do you see the electorate shaping up based on that longer history?
Well, that longer history is what brought Democrats to this moment. Their enthusiasm gap that they had for much of 2017 and 2018 allowed them to do the following things. One, they got a lot of candidates who announced that they were going to run for Congress in places they've never competed in before. So they expanded the playing field from what looked like early in 2017 it was going to be 25 or 30 seats to about 60 seats now that Republicans hold where Democrats are competitive. And the second thing, and this is very important now, of course, is the money. I have never seen so much money going to House candidates, and it is going to those candidates directly. It's not just the campaign committees or the big names that are getting these dollars. These are candidates who 2 years ago never thought they were going to run for Congress, and now they're sitting on $3-4 million war chests. That has kept Democrats not just competitive in some of these places, but in many places they're out raising and they're running more ads than the Republicans who are the incumbents. That doesn't happen in a normal election.
And as I know from reading Amy Walter, is that in the last quarter of fundraising, 112 Republican-held seats, Democrats outraised them, which means it's broad.
That's right. And it's keeping them in the game in a lot of these places where, quite frankly, looking at the numbers, they probably would have been knocked out. Democrats would have. Because these districts are not easy. They're Republican-leaning districts. So, Ed, they're Republican-leaning districts. Their Republicans hold them. Incumbents have an advantage on Election Day. So what's holding the Republicans together?
Well, I think about the people I talked to on Friday in Indiana with the president. You ask them, what is this election about? An open-ended question. Leave it up to them. Every single person in line I talked to said immigration. They're concerned about this caravan that's coming and security issues generally. And
a caravan that's 800 miles away.
That's more than 800 miles away, and it is mostly women and children. And, if it's not that, it's just security generally and how the identity and the fabric of the country may change as people like that are allowed to get in. But you talk to Democrats. And when I was in Wisconsin, talked to a woman who's devoted hours of her time to manning an office in Milwaukee. And I said, why do you do this? And she says, well, it's very simple. I want to protect my Obamacare. You go down to Waukesha County a few miles away, and you talk to a Republican woman doing the exact same thing, and Valerie told me it's because I want to be proud of my country again. So again, issues of identity and security for Republicans, domestic issues of concern like health care for Democrats across the country.
Can I also jump in on demographics, and Anthony can jump in with me too. You're right that Democrats have, that always have this demographic aspiration that doesn't necessarily turn up at the polls, but Republicans have a demographic challenge in midterms too, which is the base for Donald Trump are, yes, they're older and whiter, but they tend not to have higher levels of education. And those voters also don't tend to show up in a midterm election year. So what Trump is doing right now in ginning up the base, we talk a lot about who he needs to get out to vote. It's those voters who he had turn out for him in 2016 who most likely would sit out a midterm election.
Well, Anthony, let me build on this, but let me add one more thing to it, which is there are those who wear the red Make America Great hats again. They go to the rallies. They show up in force. There was a part of the Republican coalition in 2016, though, who said, not quite so sure about Donald Trump, but I really don't like Hillary Clinton. And that helped motivate their Republican vote. Where are those voters in this question on Tuesday?
And that's where, to the extent there is crossover, that's where it's coming from. We have talked about all fall, these voters who say the economy is good, give the president credit for the economy, and yet say they are unsatisfied with the direction of the country. That's a surprising split, and they are trending towards the Democrats. And, again, the picture of these districts, when we get to election night and we start talking about this place, that place, they're going to be suburban districts. There's going to be an argument going on about what the Republican Party looks like now. These districts were carved out for the Republicans of 10 years ago. But the Republican Party since then has gotten a little less diverse in terms of demographics, a little bit more rural, and a little bit more working class. Do they still fit into these districts? Can they still win them? Is going to be sort of an overarching theme on election night.
A fact that was in a Harris poll this week I found interesting. They asked Republicans, do you consider yourself to be more a supporter of Donald Trump or more a supporter of the Republican Party? 46% said Donald Trump. The party and Chairwoman McDaniel won't have liked this is just at 25%. So this is Donald Trump's party.
This is Donald Trump's party in his election. And you have to remark about just how amazing it is that we've gotten to this point. If we go back to 2015 and look at Donald Trump's favorable ratings among Republicans in 2015, it was something around 40%. Now he has, in the last Gallup poll, I think an 89% approval rating from Republicans. That's what makes this election also so different from traditional midterms, is that normally what happens in a midterm, the party that's in the White House less motivated to turn out than the party out. They're not as excited about their candidate as they were in the presidential. This year, Republicans are united around him in a way we didn't see with Obama in 2010. And they're more motivated to vote than, say, Republicans were in 2006.
And not only is the president on the ballot, which is to say on voters' minds, in larger numbers than typical in midterms, but the number saying they want to support him is larger than it's been in typical midterms. Often the opposition number outweighs the for number in terms of, is the president a factor in your vote?
Ed, women, okay, both on the ballot and as voters. What's your take of what we should be looking for on Tuesday?
I think either way, we're going to see more women elected into Congress, which actually changes the governing dynamic come January. You may see as many as, I think, 26 women elected to the Senate. That would be a record high. You'll see an increase certainly in the Democratic ranks, but based on projections right now, there's a good chance that the number of House Republican women will be so depleted that they're down to like 2 hands, basically, which is an embarrassing low in a year where so many women are anticipated to vote, not only in the suburbs, but really all across the country.
All right. Thanks very much, Ed. Amy's going to stick with us. Anthony, you'll be just at the table from now until Thursday or something, I think. Anyway, don't go away. We'll be right back with our political panel. And we're back with our political panel. Amy Walter is with the Cook Political Report. Ben Domenech is the publisher of The Federalist. Shauna Thomas is the Washington bureau chief at Vice News. And Nancy Cordes is our CBS News chief congressional correspondent. She spent most of the week in Florida and Georgia on the campaign trail. We're glad to have you in one place for us here, Nancy. Ben, I want to start with you. The chairwoman of the Republican Party did not want to touch that ad run by the president's campaign with a 20-foot pole. So that's one thing which you can address, but also it represents 2 closing messages here. Chairwoman McDaniel wants to talk about the economy and the strong numbers. The president wants to talk about something else.
You know, it's really telling that this is the closing weekend of a campaign season. The president just got all these great numbers in terms of the economic reports that came out. We have wage growth that we haven't seen in more than a decade in terms of the experience of the American economy. And yet that doesn't seem to be the thing that he wants to talk about at all. It's not the thing that Republicans are really talking about. This is an election that for them is a base election. And what they know is that what gets their base out there and excited and ramped up is questions of security, questions of toughness, questions of law and order, and not, hey, you've got 3.1% wage growth.
Right. Don't you have the same exact problem on the other side, which is when you hear an ad like that, when you hear some of the things the president says, people who are black, Hispanic are saying, this sounds a little bit racist to me, and that can gin people up on the Democratic side, too.
And not only that, you had Republicans saying this sounds racist to me. So it wasn't even, true. I mean, it was extraordinary to see so many Republicans come out and just straight up say this was a racist appeal. Nancy, you've been, sorry, I'm used to having Anthony to my left. Nancy, you've been out there.
Yep.
We shape this race in a lot of ways, but out in the real world, what are you seeing? How much are Democrats talking about health care and not taking the bait on some of these values issues, or what are you seeing?
Healthcare is huge. In fact, over the course of this election, Democrats have spent about $90 million on ads about healthcare. They think that this is the winning issue. Obamacare is much more popular now than it was even a few years ago. At this point, everyone knows someone with a pre-existing condition who is getting coverage because of the Affordable Care Act. Everyone watched Republicans fumbled this issue last year when suddenly they had the opportunity to come up with a plan that was panned by most healthcare groups, and people are worried about protections for people with pre-existing conditions going away. Democrats believe that that is going to be a motivating factor for enough voters, and some of the polling bears that out.
Shauna, the Democrats have shown a remarkable, I think of Will Rogers' line, I'm not a member of an organized party, I'm a Democrat, shown amazing discipline and sticking to the health care message despite the efforts by the president and the press to pull them on to something else. Do you see it that way?
I see it a little bit that way. I think one of the things that's been interesting to me is I was in Idaho, which is not a bastion of Democratic politics, I understand, last week. But Medicaid expansion is on the ballot. Yeah. And even with conservatives, they seem to be going in the direction of voting for entrenching Obamacare within Idaho. And while that doesn't mean like there will suddenly be a Democratic governor of Idaho, that does mean there's something to that health care message that speaks to a lot of people. And Democrats know that. And in some of these swing districts, that could help them turn some of the Republicans their way, possibly.
And it's also why the issue about the economy and the tax cuts isn't getting as much traction, not just from the president, but even in some of these congressional races, because what you hear from voters a lot is, that's great, maybe have a little more money, but you know what I'm spending it on? My prescription drugs, or I'm spending it on my health care costs. The cost of living is going higher than what I'm getting in my salary or whatever I got from the tax cut. And so it's a very difficult message for Republicans to sort of nuance this discussion about how great the economy is with people who are actually worrying about the most salient thing in their life and the thing they probably spend the most money on other than food, which is their health care.
I was down in Florida this week talking to Carlos Curbelo, who is in one of these classic swing districts in Florida. He said that he wishes the president would talk more about the economy. I mean, we're at 3.7% unemployment. We haven't seen a level that low since Lyndon Johnson. But the president himself admitted this week it's boring to talk about the economy. He'd rather gin people up and talk about immigration. And that is really difficult for a Republican like Curbelo in a swing district.
Well, that's why he said that caravan really ginned up our base when he was in his rally. Ben, let me... Mike Kaufman, 6th District of Colorado, another one of those tough seats up. One of his strategists said, in the last week, the president has behaved like a guy trying to build a permanent political majority in the Ozarks. The purposeful provocation on immigration just makes an already grim situation in the suburbs even more difficult. Is this a president running in a kind of Senate, save the Senate strategy, which hurts in these suburban districts that Shauna was talking about?
Absolutely. And I think that's because the Senate matters more to the president than a lot of these different House members, many of whom he doesn't even know. He doesn't have a relationship with them. He knows who John Tester is. He knows who Heidi Heitkamp is. He knows who Claire McCaskill is, and he dislikes them, and he wants to see them out. And so that's the reason that he's using the kind of approach that he has. But I think Republicans need to keep in mind, one of the real things we're going to learn in this midterm is how effective the president's strategy is in comparison to the approach that President Obama used. The problem with President Obama was that when he was on the ballot, his team came out, his base came out, they showed up. This is now President Trump trying to figure out whether he can do the same thing, in an election when he's not on the ballot, which was the same problem that was a real challenge during the Obama years for other Democrats.
In the exit polls in 2010, Democrats did not come out for President Obama to defend him in the way that our polls show that Republicans are coming to defend Donald Trump.
Yeah, and that's where that low propensity voter that I talked about earlier with Anthony, especially these voters on the Republican side, they came out for Donald Trump, don't traditionally come out. An issue like the economy, that's not going to motivate them to get out to vote. On immigration, that's going to be the issue. The question, though, in my mind, too, is there are sort of these different tiers of seats that I'm going to be watching on election night. There's the tier that we talk about, those suburban districts, especially those suburban districts that Hillary Clinton carried, Northern Virginia suburbs, Philadelphia suburbs. Thankfully, a lot of these are on East Coast time. For those of us on the East Coast, we can watch these come in. New Jersey. But the districts I'm most interested, actually, are the ones that President Obama carried, but
Yeah.
then Trump carried, right? Those districts, like, for example, in Maine, another East Coast
Maine
state,
too.
big, Maine too, it's big, has Democratic DNA. This is a labor stronghold there. Been voting for Democrats forever, but like so much of working class America moved to Trump in 2016. Where did those voters go in 2018? That's going to tell us, first of all, whether Democrats have a great night or just an okay night, and also what it means about this Trump coalition. Do they show up only when Trump's on the ballot, or have they also decided they're not as enamored with Trump in some of these places that have Democratic DNA than in some of the other parts of the country like the South?
And look, let's face it, I mean, Democrats have almost nowhere to go but up. Republicans have a near historic majority in the House right now. They picked up 63 seats back in 2010. They added to it after that. So if Democrats don't pick up seats on Tuesday night, then the party has even bigger problems than I thought.
And a historic anomaly. Hold these thoughts. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more from our panel. And we're back with more from our panel. Shauna, you've been looking at the 25th District in California.
Yep.
Why?
Well, basically, one, Vice News has been following Katie Hill around since February to track how a congressional campaign works. But what's interesting is this is one of those districts that went for Hillary Clinton in 2016, but elected a Republican congressman. It is an incredibly tight race, and it's gotten tighter in the last few weeks. And it doesn't seem like it's because of health care. It doesn't seem like it's because of immigration or race baiting. It seems like it's because there's a gas tax repeal on the ballot. And these are people who live 40, 50 miles from L.A. proper. They vote on their pocketbooks. It's actually kind of standard politics, which I have to admit I was kind of happy to see.
Sure, yes, regular old politics.
Exactly. Your pocketbook and gas.
Right, exactly. Nancy, what are you going to be looking for on Tuesday night?
Well, I'm watching for a couple of things. First of all, women. I think that that's going to be really fascinating. I mean, anecdotally, we see that women, particularly educated women, have been turned off by some of the things that President Trump has to say. They were turned off by the Kavanaugh nomination spectacle. Are they really, moving towards the Democratic Party, or, do they come home at the end of the day? I think for me, another thing is independent voters, and whether President Trump really is the kryptonite to independent voters that we've seen in some of the polling recently. And then finally, this split between the House and the Senate. I mean, it's very possible that even if Democrats take control of the House, they could lose a seat or two in the Senate. And what does that mean for the balance of power in Washington and the ability of Congress to get anything done over the next 2 years?
Ben, do you think that Republicans are taking lessons from what the president's doing? And maybe the lessons will all be determined by the final outcome. But let's say Republicans have a better night. What will Republicans see from the president's strategy here at the end? What learnings will they take from that going forward?
Well, I think that they'll be, frankly, one of the lessons they'll take is that it doesn't help to sort of shy away from cultural war. I think the president has really, wrapped his arms around the cultural war in America in a way that we haven't seen a politician do before in the modern era. And I think that the lesson that a lot of different Republican politicians are taking away from that is that this is something that they should be eager for. In terms of what I'm kind of going to be looking at, early on in the night, I think we're going to know how big of a wave we're going to see thanks to some of the kind of pairs of seats in some of these early East Coast states. I look at something like Virginia 5 and Virginia 7. If both of those go to Democrats, then that means that we're probably in for a blue tidal wave. And historically, that is, I think, what we should expect to happen in this election. We should expect it to break in the direction of Democrats and break in that way significantly. On the flip side, I look at a state like Florida and anticipating the kind of historical ticket splitting that you've seen there could easily result in a situation where perhaps Rick Scott wins the Senate seat, Andrew Gillum wins the governorship. That's going to be a huge factor in terms of determining things post the next census and everything else that happens in a state that's critical for the presidential year.
You've been down in Florida. What have you noticed in Florida that's different from every other Florida when we're obsessed with Florida every other election cycle?
Well, it's fascinating to have this marquee race, at the top of the ticket, this governor's race that is driving so much. I think Senator Nelson, for example, would be in much worse shape if he didn't have this incredibly dynamic campaigner at the top of the ballot in Andrew Gillum, who's sort of, if Nelson does win, on Tuesday night, he will have Gillum in part to thank for that. But I'll also be very curious to see, some of the strategy for Andrew Gillum, for someone like a Stacey Abrams in Georgia, for someone like a Beto O'Rourke in Texas, has to do with fundamentally changing the electorate in their states. And they have a lot of confidence that they're doing that. We see some anecdotal signs in early voting that they might be right, but it's a peril to read too much into early voting. But that is going to be fascinating as well. At the end of the day, did they manage to really change the electorate in their states, bring out hundreds of thousands of new voters, minority voters, who don't typically vote in midterm elections, let alone presidential elections? And
that's going to set the tone for 2020, quite frankly, because for all the talk about what is the president doing to see if he can get his base out and what lessons are Republicans going to take from this, what lessons are Democrats going to take if they succeed or if they fail about the kind of candidate they need on top of the ticket in 2020.
If the lessons from the culture war that you're talking about, the Republicans learned that embracing that works, if we also see an amazing turnout of minority voters in Florida and Georgia, Stacey Abrams, Andrew Gillum win, that shows that culture war may not be a good thing to embrace come 2020.
What role do you think the president has played, if at all, President Obama here talking about?
I mean, you know what? I always ask a bunch of Democrats all the time, who is the leader of the Democratic Party? And usually the answer I either get is they don't know who the leader of the Democratic Party is, or Barack Obama is the leader of the Democratic Party. The guy who's at the top still, the guy who energizes people, is coming out. That reminds people that there is an election. I think that's about the best you can do right now.
And what do you make of the Midwest? We had the president doing well there in 2016. The president did well there in 2016. People said, oh, the Midwest is changing. But now a lot of Republicans are in trouble.
You could absolutely see Scott Walker lose, I think, on Tuesday. I think you could see a lot of difficulty in parts of the Midwest. But back to this culture war point, I think that the fact is, you look at a state like Missouri, where Claire McCaskill made the calculated judgment to go against Brett Kavanaugh in a similar situation to what was facing Joe Manchin, a state where the president is significantly popular. And that's really, frankly, put Josh Hawley back into a position where he could beat her, when before it was a race that looked like it might actually be out of reach for Republicans. This is going to be a very interesting night because there's so many different lessons to take away from it. Democrats are going to be able to take a lesson away of, yes, we resisted, yes, we came back, we took back the House after having all these years of not being able to be in leadership post the Obamacare decision. And then Republicans are going to, I think, take a lot of lessons away from which senators they are able to replace, if any, on the Democratic side. That's going to flow into the decisions they make in 2020, as Amy said, about the nomination battle.
And in 1982, Walter Mondale was on the CBS Evening News on election night preparing for his 84 race. So 2020 is going to start right on election night, too. I'm just saying that's what history tells us. I can't, not me, it's history. Thanks to all of you for being with us, and we'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thanks for watching. It's goodbye for me, too. Margaret Brennan will be back at the anchor desk in Washington next Sunday. She's been focusing on the new member of our Face the Nation team. That's Eamon. I'm John Dickerson. See you tomorrow on CBS This Morning. Thanks so much for watching.